Winter in medieval Europe was a completely different reality compared to our times. It was not a season of cozy evenings with hot cocoa, but a brutal, months-long battle for physical survival. The temperature dropped relentlessly, chilling people to the bone, and turned an ordinary wooden hut into a veritable ice trap. It is interesting to observe how historical facts shatter romantic illusions about beautiful bygone eras. There were no fragrant nights or fresh rural landscapes in winter. There was only harsh practicality, where aesthetics and comfort were always sacrificed for the basic thermal efficiency of the dwelling. Modern survival experts call this adaptation to a hostile external environment. Peasants simply called it life, without giving a second thought to lofty matters or the scientific rationale behind their actions. They instinctively created a microclimate around themselves that blocked the frost, repelled deadly insects, and preserved their meager food supplies. In winter, life in a medieval village ground to a halt, turning into an hourly struggle against the biting cold. People could not afford the luxury of heating empty rooms or building separate, well-insulated barns. The solution found was simple, radical, and incredibly effective in its physical essence. With the onset of severe frosts, peasants brought all their livestock right inside their single dwelling. Cows, pigs, goats, and poultry became full-fledged neighbors to the people for the long winter months. Usually, the animals were separated from the living area by only a thin, symbolic wicker partition, and sometimes they slept right in the same room as their owners. It is hard for a modern person to even imagine the level of stench that reigned in a closed room with a dozen animals. The smell of fresh manure, urine, wet fur, and unwashed bodies was so thick you could cut it with a knife. It seems utterly insane to voluntarily turn one's bedroom into a barn, risking suffocation from the miasma. However, behind this apparent unsanitary condition lay a brilliant engineering calculation based on the laws of thermodynamics. Each animal was a powerful, non-stop biological heat generator. A large cow, for example, emits as much thermal energy as a modern medium-power electric heater. A few cows and a dozen sheep, confined in a small room, created a tremendous amount of heat. Their bodies functioned as living radiators, continuously radiating life-saving warmth into the freezing air of the hut. Without this free and constant source of heat, the family would inevitably have frozen to death on the very first harsh night. Interestingly, this practice persisted in some cold regions of Europe well into the 19th century. Peasants desperately resisted attempts by enlightened doctors to force them to build separate barns. The doctors spoke of unsanitary conditions and the risk of disease from constant contact with manure. The peasants, however, knew full well that death from pneumonia or hypothermia would come much faster than from a hypothetical infection. The practical experience of generations always prevailed over the theoretical arguments of city doctors. Being in the same room with pigs and cows created a distinctive soundscape and aroma. At night, the house filled with smacking, mooing, snoring, and the loud release of intestinal gases. A modern person would not be able to sleep for a single minute amid such cacophony. But for a medieval farmer, these sounds were the best lullaby, signifying that the family's greatest wealth was alive. As long as the cow chewed steadily and breathed out warmth, the family had a chance to survive until the spring thaw. The animal's heat output was so crucial that the layout of early Scandinavian longhouses was built specifically around this concept. The barn was located at the lower end of the long structure, and the heat from the animals naturally rose toward the living area. People literally designed their architecture to maximize the efficiency of these living heaters. Not a single watt of precious heat was to be wasted through cracks in the walls. The smell, of course, also concentrated inside the house, permeating clothing, hair, and even food. Ultimately, having animals in the house was not a sign of backwardness, but a sign of harsh adaptation. It was humanity's response to the cruelty of nature when resources were critically scarce. Modern central heating has spared people the need to share their bedrooms with cows. But it is worth remembering that it was precisely this smelly, warm barn that helped the ancestors of modern humans survive the darkest and coldest centuries. These living heaters worked reliably for centuries, saving entire nations from freezing to death. The center of any medieval dwelling was always an open hearth, around which all life revolved. Fire provided light, warmth, and the ability to cook hot food, without which surviving the winter would have been impossible. However, in most homes of that time, there was no such thing as a chimney, which is so common today. Smoke from the fire simply rose to the ceiling and slowly seeped out through cracks in the thatched roof or a small opening. Because of this, the entire interior of the hut was constantly filled with a thick, acrid, and tear-inducing haze. A modern person would be horrified by such an atmosphere, reminiscent of a gas chamber. From constantly being in such a room, people's eyes would redden and water, they would develop a chronic cough, and all their clothes would smell of the fire. Living in a cloud of smoke seems completely illogical, as it is a direct path to serious respiratory diseases. A logical question arises: why did people endure such torment for centuries instead of simply building a chimney? The answer lies in yet another hidden threat, one far more terrifying than a cough. This suffocating wood smoke served as a vital chemical weapon in the ongoing war against parasites. Medieval homes were literally teeming with fleas, lice, bedbugs, and ticks, which not only bit but also carried deadly infections. Without constant fumigation, these insects would have multiplied to such an extent that they could have drained a person of all their blood. The thick smoke that filled the dwelling contained carbon monoxide and fine solid particles that clogged the insect's respiratory tracts. It functioned as an ancient, brutal, yet incredibly effective counterpart to modern insect spray. It's interesting to compare this with modern methods of indoor pest control. Today, specialized services use hot fog generators and toxic chemicals, forcing residents to leave their homes for a day. Ancient people simply lived inside this fog generator year-round, combining soup making with total disinfection. Of course, this affected life expectancy and lung health, but in the Middle Ages, few people lived to old age for a variety of reasons. The main goal was to survive the current season, and the smoke brilliantly accomplished this tactical mission. Over time, construction technology became more sophisticated, and the wealthy began to install real stone chimneys. The air in the castles became cleaner, breathing became easier, and clothes stopped smelling like a perpetual bonfire. But it was precisely at this moment that the aristocracy faced an incredible invasion of parasites in their clean bedrooms. The absence of smoke meant that the lord's silk sheets became an ideal haven for fleas and bedbugs. The nobility had to devise elaborate flea combs and scratching tools, while the peasants continued to rely on the trusty smoke screen. In addition, smoke had another important property. It effectively masked the smell of unwashed bodies and animal manure. When wood is constantly burning in a room, all other odors fade into the background, overshadowed by the smell of smoke. Thus, the absence of a chimney was not a sign of architectural folly, but a compromise in the fight for health. Smoke served as a universal insecticide, a means of masking odors, and a guarantee that the house would not rot from the inside. Modern aerosols handle this task faster and without causing coughing, but ancient people had no chemical industry. They had only fire, firewood, and the iron logic of survival in a world full of invisible, microscopic killers. The problem of heating homes inevitably came down to the availability of combustible materials. It seems obvious that a fire needs firewood, and medieval Europe was covered in dense forests. However, the reality turned out to be much harsher. In most regions, peasants were strictly forbidden from cutting down trees for firewood. The forest belonged to the local feudal lord or the king, and illegal logging was severely punished. Even with hanging or the cutting off of hands, people found themselves in a paradoxical situation. They were freezing in the midst of vast forests, yet had no right to take even a single branch. It was precisely this acute shortage of wood that forced people to seek alternative energy sources, leading to a rather foul-smelling solution. The salvation came in the form of the excrement of the very animals that served as living batteries in the peasants' homes during the winter. Cow dung was carefully collected, mixed with straw, and dried in the sun or wind throughout the warm season. By winter, this had turned into dense, dry biopellet briquettes, which became the primary and often the only fuel for the hearth. A modern person would be horrified by the idea of cooking food and warming up by a fire made of burning feces. The process of burning manure was accompanied by an incredibly heavy, distinctive odor that quickly filled the entire house. It was a thick, sweetish, putrid aroma mixed with the smell of burnt straw and earth. Imagine a modern kitchen where someone suddenly decided to fry the contents of a cowshed on a gas stove. It seems that enduring such a stench is simply impossible, especially in a tightly sealed room without proper ventilation. But people had no choice. The only alternative to this smell was a cold death in a frozen bed. The economics of manure use were flawless and created a completely waste-free production system within a single farm. The cow ate free grass, provided milk, warmed the house with her body, and her waste was turned into free charcoal for the fire. Modern concepts of a circular economy and zero-waste production pale in comparison to medieval peasant farming. People of the past squeezed the maximum useful output from every molecule of matter available to them. The smell of burning manure was the smell of energy independence from a greedy lord. Of course, one had to get used to this distinctive aroma, but the human sense of smell has an amazing ability to adapt. After a few weeks of constant use of manure fuel, people simply stopped noticing its pungent odor. The smell seeped into their clothes and hair, permeated the walls, and even gave a distinctive smoky flavor to the food cooked over the hearth. It was the scent of home, of plenty and safety, contrasting with the whistling, icy wind beyond the thin walls of the hut. Under those conditions, olfactory aesthetic pretensions were considered an unseemly luxury reserved for the wealthy. Manure fire had another, less obvious advantage. It produced virtually no sparks, unlike coniferous firewood. In a house with a dry thatched roof, a stray spark could instantly lead to a catastrophic fire. Slow smoldering dung was much safer for wooden structures, reducing the risk of accidental fire significantly. Peasants received stable, predictable heat without the risk of waking up in a blazing inferno because of a single stray ember. Safety always came first, even if it meant putting up with the stench. Among other things, the ash from the burned manure wasn't thrown away but put to use. It was a valuable fertilizer for the fields in the spring, completing an incredible agricultural cycle of survival. What today seems like repulsive, unsanitary practices was a complex chemical and agronomic strategy. Every element of the system supported another, leaving no room for waste or useless byproducts. And this cycle was set in motion despite any odors. In the end, the use of manure as fuel was a triumph of practicality over squeamishness. People managed to transform the most repulsive material into a source of life, warmth, and safety. The architecture of a medieval peasant house was extremely utilitarian, and floors in such structures were rarely made of planks. Wood was an expensive material, so most huts had a simple earthen floor, tightly packed down by generations of inhabitants. In winter, this floor froze solid, turning into a veritable ice rink that drew heat from the feet and cooled the entire room. To avoid walking on the frozen ground, people invented a peculiar kind of carpet, which today would cause panic in any health inspector. The entire floor surface was thickly covered with a layer of straw, reeds, or dry grasses, creating an organic cushion. At first glance, the idea of covering the cold ground with straw sounds logical and quite innocent. The problem lay in how exactly this covering was used over the course of many months without a thorough cleaning. The top layer of reeds was sometimes replaced before holidays, but the lower layers could lie on the ground for years, accumulating an incredible amount of dirt. Soup was spilled onto this floor. Carpet, people spat on it. The family dogs urinated there, and slush and manure dripped from shoes. Over time, this entire mass turned into a wet, rotting, foul-smelling compost right under the feet of the house's inhabitants. The rotting bottom layer of straw, saturated with moisture and organic matter, triggered a process of active composting right inside the hut. Modern gardeners know that as organic matter decomposes, bacteria release a huge amount of thermal energy. This rotting floor acted as a primitive heating system, creating a powerful thermal barrier between the frozen ground and the living space. The rotting process literally generated heat, preventing frost from seeping into the room from below. It was a medieval-style heated floor that warmed the feet at the cost of an incredible stench. Moreover, the thick layer of packed straw excellently trapped air, creating an ideal air gap. Modern insulation works on the same principle. It simply trapped still air, preventing heat from escaping. Peasants couldn't go to a hardware store for mineral wool, so they used what grew in the nearest marsh. Even if this insulation smelled like a cesspool, at least you could walk on it barefoot in the January frost. The difference between the frozen ground and the warm, rotting straw was a matter of sheer survival. To at least somewhat mask the smell of decay, the top layer was sometimes sprinkled with fragrant herbs or fresh straw. This created an illusion of freshness for a couple of days, until the new straw was trampled into the general damp mass. The result was a multi-layered cake of generations of trash, food scraps, and vegetation that gave way underfoot. The smell of this floor was the hallmark of any home, differing only in nuances depending on the family's diet. The house smelled of earth, dampness, and life recycling itself. Modern, eco-friendly homes often use organic insulation made from straw and hemp, returning to their roots. The only difference is that today these materials are dried, treated to prevent rot, and sewn into the walls. Ancient people did not have such technologies. They let nature do its work right under their feet, extracting heat from decomposition. It was a crude, foul-smelling, but strikingly effective engineering approach. A rotting floor was yet another proof that in the fight against the cold, all means are acceptable. People are willing to put up with any stench if it helps them retain their body heat. This damp, dirty cushion saved more lives than many medieval medicines. And while the aristocrats turned up their noses, the peasants spent the winter in peace, warming their feet on their biological reactor. The daily burning of an open fire in the center of the house had another inevitable consequence: the widespread formation of soot. The inner surface of the thatched roof, the wooden beams, rafters, and even the walls eventually became covered with a thick, black layer of soot. This oily, shiny film had seeped so deeply into the wood that the interior of the house looked as if it had been painted with black tar. The constant smell of ingrained smoke, wood tar, and ash hung in the house all year round, never dissipating even in summer. To a modern person, such an interior would seem like the aftermath of a terrible fire, after which it would be impossible to live in the room. It seems completely illogical that people did not try to clean their homes of this black, soiling layer. Any touch of the walls or beams left hard to remove black stains on their hands and clothes. The house turned into a gloomy, foul-smelling cave, where soot constantly rained down on people's heads and into their food. One gets the impression of incredible laziness and indifference on the part of the peasants toward the basic cleanliness of their homes. However, like so much in the Middle Ages, this grime served a hidden yet absolutely critical function for survival. The science of chemistry provides a clear explanation. Wood smoke contains a huge amount of resins and creosote. Settling on the straw and wooden floors, these substances turned into a powerful natural antiseptic and preservative. A thick layer of soot literally sealed the pores of the wood, making it completely impervious to moisture and decay. What looked like impenetrable grime was, in fact, an ideal water-repellent coating. Without this chemical protection, wooden houses would have rotted away from constant dampness within a few years. In addition to protecting against moisture, soot brilliantly dealt with biological threats attacking the structures. Wood-boring insects, termites, and bark beetles categorically refused to settle in beams saturated with toxic creosote. For them, this coating was a deadly poison that destroyed their digestive systems. If the beams had remained untreated, the beetles would have reduced the load-bearing structures to dust in a matter of seasons, causing the building to collapse. Soot preserved the structural integrity of the building, saving people from dying under the rubble of their own homes. Rodents also hated the taste and smell of the soot-covered straw on the underside of the roof. Rats often tried to gnaw their way into the warm thatched roof to build nests and survive the winter. But when faced with a thick layer of bitter, toxic soot, they retreated, preferring to seek out cleaner places. Thus, soot acted as a chemical barrier, protecting the home from the invasion of disease carriers. The stench was the price paid to keep the roof from turning into a massive rat city right above one's head. Modern builders use toxic chemical treatments for the same purposes, working in respirators. They apply poisons to the boards so they last longer in humid climates. Medieval people simply breathed in these substances daily, achieving the same construction result. What modern enthusiasts of the past often strip away in historic homes for aesthetic reasons was their primary protection. By destroying the layer of centuries-old soot, restorers often expose the wood to the risk of rapid decay. A medieval person would never have scraped their beams down to the bare wood. They understood that this black, oily grime was their faithful ally in the battle against entropy and the forces of nature. And if that ally smelled like burnt resin, so be it. A layer of soot on the ceiling is a striking example of how a byproduct of daily life became a lifesaver. The grime that we wash away today with harsh detergents once served as a high-tech polymer. It preserved homes, repelled pests, and preserved wood for decades. This forces us to look in a completely different light at what we today consider simply unsanitary. In a world without technology, dirt often served as the technology itself. The topic of relieving oneself in the Middle Ages often causes modern people to shudder with disgust. In peasant homes buried in snow, using an outdoor toilet posed a serious problem at night. Therefore, it was perfectly standard practice to use chamber pots, buckets, or wooden tubs right inside the living quarters. These containers were placed in the sleeping area, often behind a light screen, and were actively used by all family members throughout the long winter night. Until morning, no one dared to go outside to empty these foul-smelling vessels. As a result, by morning, the enclosed, unventilated space of the house was filled with the unbearable stench of human excrement and urine. This aroma mingled with the smells of livestock, smoke, rotting floorboards, and sweat, creating an apocalyptic olfactory landscape. A modern person, waking up in such an atmosphere, would most likely experience an instant wave of nausea. Sleeping in a room where an open bucket containing the waste products of several people stands seems like the height of degradation and unsanitary conditions. However, behind this repulsive custom lay cold calculation and a real threat to life. The fact is that stepping out of a heated, stuffy house into the icy night wind was a deadly undertaking. The temperature difference could exceed 40 degrees, from a warm 15 degrees inside to minus 25 outside. The human body, lulled by sleep and warmth, experienced a massive physiological shock upon sudden exposure to the cold. Blood vessels constricted sharply, the immune system took a severe blow, and the airways were seared by the icy air. For a peasant weakened by meager winter rations, such a nighttime journey often ended in fatal pneumonia. Medicine at that time had no antibiotics, and any serious lung infection meant almost certain death. People understood this cause and effect relationship perfectly well. Go out into the cold at night, die of a fever a week later. Moreover, the process of putting on complex, multi-layered woolen clothing in the dark would have taken too much time. Stepping out into the cold half-dressed meant instant hypothermia, and getting dressed just to spend 2 minutes outside was impractical. For thousands of years, people were forced to make harsh compromises between hygiene and survival. The choice was always made in favor of survival, because the dead no longer need clean air, and the chamber pot was one of the main tools of that choice. This unpleasant historical fact teaches us not to judge our ancestors by the standards of modern comfort. What seems barbaric today was yesterday the only reasonable solution to the problem. The smell of urine and feces in the hut was the smell of living people who had managed to survive yet another terrifying night. They woke up alive, warm, and able to continue their struggle against merciless nature. And that victory was worth any olfactory inconvenience. The clothing of medieval people differed radically from what we wear today, and the main material was coarse sheep's wool. People wore woolen garments year-round, taking them off only rarely, and washing such items was a rare and technically complex undertaking. Over time, these garments absorbed absolutely every scent in the home. The acrid smoke of the fire, the smell of fried lard, manure, and human sweat. But the dominant olfactory note was the specific heavy smell of the unprocessed wool itself, reminiscent of a wet flock of sheep. These clothes smelled so strongly that a modern person would feel nauseous just by getting close to a medieval peasant. One might ask, why couldn't these items be washed more often or made from lighter, more comfortable materials? Linen existed, but it was expensive to produce and did not provide the necessary level of protection against the cold. Infrequent washing of woolen garments in hot water with harsh lye, which served as a substitute for soap, quickly ruined the fabric. But there was another, even more important reason why wool was washed rarely and worn for years, despite the growing stench. The secret lay in a natural animal wax that coated every fiber and gave the clothing magical properties. We're talking about lanolin, a thick, fat-like substance secreted by sheep's sebaceous glands to protect against the elements. In the modern textile industry, lanolin is often washed out of wool to eliminate the animal odor and make the fabric softer. Medieval weavers, on the other hand, tried to preserve as much of this natural fat as possible in the finished cloth. Unprocessed, lanolin-soaked wool possessed incredible water-repellent properties, functioning as an ancient counterpart to modern membrane fabrics like Gore-Tex. Water simply rolled off this greasy, foul-smelling surface without penetrating or getting the fabric wet. Interestingly, modern sailors and fishermen in the harsh northern seas still value sweaters made of untreated sheep's wool. They know that even if such a sweater gets wet, it will still keep the body warm thanks to the physics of wool fibers. Medieval peasants understood this principle through trial and error, without knowing the chemistry of complex polymers. They simply observed that sheep stood calmly in the rain without freezing and borrowed their natural protection. Dirty, smelly wool was their main technological advantage in a climate where slush and frost reigned for half the year. In addition, lanolin itself has mild antibacterial properties, protecting the skin from certain infections. The oily wool rubbed less against the skin, creating a kind of lubricant, which was important during heavy physical labor. The stench of this clothing repelled certain insects, which disliked the concentrated smell of animal wax and stale sweat. It was multifunctional clothing that served as a raincoat, a heater, and an antiseptic all at once. Aesthetics and a pleasant scent were sacrificed for absolute utility. As a result, the distinctive scent of medieval clothing is not a sign of uncleanliness, but proof of ingenious adaptation. People utilized natural materials to their fullest potential, preserving their natural protective properties. Modern fashion favors fabrics that are clean and pleasant to the touch, sacrificing their durability. Ancient people could not afford to be fashionable. Their task was to stay alive until spring. In the Middle Ages, people had no concept of microorganisms, bacteria, or viruses causing terrible epidemics. They believed in the theory of miasms, invisible poisonous vapors that supposedly carried diseases through the air. It was believed that any foul odor was a deadly miasm that penetrated the body and caused, for example, bubonic plague. The paradox was that the medieval home itself was a source of thousands of foul odors. To protect themselves from hypothetical miasms from the street, peasants devised a method that made the atmosphere inside the hut even more unbearable. To combat the stench, which was considered a disease, people scattered strongly scented herbs thickly across the rotting floor. Wormwood, tansy, lavender, rue, rosemary, and mint covered the earthen floors in a thick layer. When people walked on these herbs, essential oils were released, filling the house with an incredibly sharp, concentrated aroma. This herbal assault on the sense of smell mingled with the stench of manure, old meat, soot, and unwashed bodies. The result was such a heavy, suffocating olfactory cocktail that it would immediately trigger a migraine in a modern person. It would seem that this practice was utterly useless, since the theory of miasms is fundamentally flawed, and diseases are transmitted by microbes. Scattering mint over the filth looks like a desperate and foolish attempt to mask unbearable, unsanitary conditions with floral scents. Doctors of that era, who wore the famous masks with beaks stuffed with herbs, seem today to be a symbol of medical ignorance. However, hidden within this crazy, nose-stinging herbal madness lay an amazing and life-saving scientific truth. Without realizing it, people had created a powerful biological shield against real carriers of death. This is one of the most striking examples of how a flawed theory led to an absolutely correct practical result. The pungent smell of herbs irritated the respiratory tracts of parasites, forcing them to leave their hosts or disrupting their ability to reproduce. It is fascinating to observe how the ancient instinct to seek out strongly scented plants is now being confirmed in laboratories. Pharmaceutical companies extract substances from wormwood and tansy to create modern tick and flea treatments for pets. Of course, the combination of scents in the house was truly mad. Sweet lavender mingled with pungent wormwood, cow manure, and smoke. This cacophony of smells was meant to drown out the breath of death, and from a psychological standpoint, it worked flawlessly. People smelled the strong scent and believed they were protected, which reduced panic and stress. And a calm, stress-free body always resists even the most terrifying infections better. The placebo effect overlapped with the plant's actual insecticidal action. In summary, the fight against miasmas using fragrant herbs is a triumph of practical experience over a lack of scientific knowledge. What smelled like a perfume shop that had exploded inside a cow shed functioned as a high-tech sanitary cordon. People survived thanks to pungent odors, without even understanding the true mechanics of this salvation. This proves once again that nothing in history is straightforward, and every stench had its own hidden, vital purpose. Ancient people were not ignorant fools who simply enjoyed living in filth and breathing soot in cramped huts. They were brilliant, practical engineers who solved incredibly complex problems of thermodynamics and epidemiology using the primitive means available to them. And every unpleasant odor in their homes was a sign of a successfully functioning defense mechanism. Modern society has grown accustomed to perceiving the absence of odors as the norm, and any strong scents as an anomaly. The hygiene industry has conditioned people to believe that a safe environment must smell of alpine freshness or citrus. But as soon as the electricity is cut off, the gas supply stopped, and chemical repellents removed from stores, reality will quickly make itself known. Humanity will once again have to seek warmth from the bodies of animals and preserve food in thick wood smoke. And then the heavy, acrid smell of survival will once again become the most desirable scent on Earth. Historical analysis shows that comfort is a very recent and incredibly fragile achievement of civilization. For centuries, harsh practicality was the norm, where every resource was used to the fullest, regardless of its scent. A peasant's home was a living organism, a machine for survival that processed dirt, smoke, and manure into vital energy. Understanding this fact compels us to regard our ancestors with deep respect, not with condescending arrogance. They conquered nature with its own weapons, however foul-smelling they might be. Summing up this historical journey, one thing can be said with certainty. Survival never smelled of violets. It was a dirty, arduous, and incredibly complex process that demanded complete self-sacrifice and the abandonment of squeamishness. And when we look back, we see not just dark ages full of filth and ignorance. We see incredible fortitude and the ability to find salvation in the most unexpected and unpleasant things. The scent of the Middle Ages was the true scent of survival, and that is precisely why it saved humanity.